This is Jim Andrews from the Vermont. Well, I was going to tell you I was from the Vermont Reptile Amphibian Atlas. Forget that. From the Salisbury Conservation Commission. And the Salisbury Conservation Commission had initially planned a local in-person presentation from Kent McFarland, but due to the pandemic, we decided to go Zoom. And last I heard, we had maybe close to 300 people, Kent, that we have signed up. So I think this is a fantastic way to get this information out about bumblebees. I think we're particularly fortunate to have Kent and the Vermont Center for Ecostudies here in Vermont doing work with insects. And there's just tens of thousands of species out there. And we don't even know what they all are and what's missing. And to have people like Kent spending a lot of time out there filling in some of those gaps, I think is essential if we're going to try to manage and conserve what we have. So without any further ado, thank you from the Salisbury Conservation Commission for joining us. And maybe we'll do this again sometime. Ken?
Yeah, no, thank you, Jim. I appreciate it. It's always great to be in person, but like you said, the advantage is there's a lot of people tuned in, and we're recording this also so people can watch it afterwards too. And so the power of electronics right now in this time of COVID is on our side, I guess. But yeah, like Jim said, there's a lot to learn about insects around the world, but even here in Vermont, I mean, we feel like we have a pretty good grip on conservation of species in Vermont. And it turns out with insects and other invertebrates, we actually don't even know what species are here yet. So there's a whole wide world of exploration to be done here in Vermont. I actually got involved in studying insects and bumblebees by accident. I actually started out my career as an ornithologist, as a bird geek, and I've done a lot of work up in the mountains with things like Bicknell's thrush and black-billed warbler. But as luck goes, I couldn't help but watch other things like butterflies and bees. And so while I was doing bird work, I started watching butterflies years ago, and I realized there wasn't much known about butterflies in Vermont. So I ended up doing a butterfly atlas with Brian Pfeiffer and a bunch of other folks. Maybe some of you folks helped us out in the audience. And while doing this butterfly atlas, we were actually one day in the UVM insect collection studying the historic butterflies there. And Leif Richardson, who's a biologist in Vermont and works for Stone Environmental, he was in there looking at bumblebees. And I got to talking with him by accident. I said, I noticed all these bumblebees while I'm out doing butterfly surveys, and what's known about the bumblebees? And he basically was, well, we should tackle a bumblebee survey when you're done with your butterfly survey here in Vermont, because it's a black hole. We don't know a whole lot about what the bumblebee status is across Vermont as a whole. And this was back in about 2004. So I ended up finishing up work with the butterflies, and I contacted Leif, and lo and behold, he was ready to do it. So a few years ago, we ended up doing a bumblebee atlas too of Vermont. And so I come to bumblebees by accident, and my guru really is Leif Richardson and others, Spencer Hardy and others who are in the state. And I just wanted to make things happen with bumblebees and got caught up in it and fell in love with them too. So hopefully after today, you'll have a little bit better appreciation for bumblebees and learn a little bit more about their conservation status in Vermont, because all is not well with bumblebees, unfortunately, in Vermont and actually likely worldwide. Just a few notes. There is a chat box, so if you have a question, Nathaniel Sharp, another biologist at BC, is watching that chat box, so he can answer any questions that you might have, plus pose them to me if he doesn't know. And I did get a lot of questions by email already, and I'll probably just answer those directly to their email. So by all means, at any time, tonight, tomorrow, 30 days from now, drop me an email, ask me questions. I'm happy to try to answer them or point you to somebody that would know the answer to it. So, if you get more and more interested and have more and more questions as time goes on, you can easily find me electronically for sure. All right, bumblebees. One second here while there we go. So the first thing I always like to make sure people understand is, what is actually a bee? And bees belong to the group Hymenoptera. So they're really closely related to ants and wasps. They're just bees are fancy wasps in a sense. They're younger than wasps um, on the historic tree. They all feed pollen to their young. And the key thing about bees is if you look at them microscopically, you'll see they have these branched hairs. It's an adaptation for carrying pollen on these hairs. Wasps don't have branch hairs. Bees don't have branch hairs. Only bees have branched hairs, and they really tend to be really hairy. Most bees. They also have a lot of adaptations for carrying pollen. Not just the hairs, but also you can see on this bumblebee down on the lower side here. Right here is called the corbicula, and that's actually on bumblebees, a specialized spot on their rear leg for queens and workers, for the females, to carry loaves of pollen back to the nest. So she'll gather the pollen in her mouth and use a little spit and a little nectar that she drinks and create a loaf of pollen and store it like a saddlebag right in that area of her leg and carry it back. And you can see in your garden sometimes, you'll see these little packs of pollen they're carrying back to their nest. So they have these special adaptations. So one of the things, is most important, we all know, is that they're really, really important animals for us for crop pollination. And so I always like to pose a question like, what do you think the percent of crops are that are pollinated by bees and other animal pollinators? 10%, 35%, 70%, or 95%? It turns out it's actually really high. It's about 70% of our crops rely on pollination from animals. It's a really amazing number. It's worth hundreds of billions of dollars a year. And if we didn't have, even in some crops that can be pollinated but otherwise would have really low fruit set without some of these bee species, like blueberries, which are some of my favorite. Without bees, blueberries, we would not have blueberries. Tomatoes, apples, all these things really rely on bees and other crop pollinators. So, and for us economically and ecologically, we can't do without them. A few years ago, Whole Foods Market had a promotion where they were trying to promote pollinators, and they went to one of their Whole Foods stores and took a picture of the Whole Foods section of fruit and vegetables, where everything there, all your choices there were available if we have bees pollinating. And then they removed everything from their store that were pollinated by bees. So they pretended like, what happens if bees disappeared? This is what the section looked like. It was about 52% of the normal product mix was gone if we lost bees. So we would have a very different diet without bees. They did the same thing with the dairy section. You don't often think about dairy as relying on pollination, but it does. Without bees, this is what the dairy section looked like. So it's clearly, as most of us know, bees are a huge, huge important component to our economy, to our diet, and to the ecology, the natural ecology of everything around us. They're a keystone species, a keystone group. Right before I jumped on this Zoom call, I looked at Twitter, and when you know it, the leading news story for me on Twitter was a study that just came out today showing that in 13 states, there was an alarming loss of pollination by wild bees that is affecting apple and cherry crops over 13 states right now. And they found that most of the pollination was being done by wild bees on these crops, and that the pollinators were failing to have a heavy fruit set. I haven't read the whole story yet, but it's just amazing that popped up just now. So it's happening right now that we are starting to lose bee populations. We're going to get into that in a little bit. So if you think about Vermont, not a very big state, how many bee species do you think, total bee species, live in Vermont? Introduced and native species. 28, 57, 132, or 305. This always surprises a lot of people. We actually have, right now, we know of 305 species of bees that live in Vermont. And we're right now led by one of our biologists at VC, we're right now in the middle of a statewide survey of bee species to try to figure out how many species we have. We have added about 45 new species in the last year to the Vermont list. We didn't even know existed here. Out of those 305 species, about 9 of them are introduced species, including honeybees, which were introduced from Europe, of course, the old world. And then across North America, there's about 4,000 species. So compared to North America, we don't have a whole lot of species. But 305 is definitely enough to handle. And then worldwide, there's about 20,000 bees. And I love to show this picture, which is the smallest bee, this Perdita, bee in a Perdita genus, on top of the head of a carpenter bee. So in that 20,000 world species, there is a crazy amount of morphological differences amongst all these bees. So getting a little bit closer to what we're talking about tonight, bumblebees. How many bumblebee species are in Vermont? Well, when I pose this question, believe it or not, and maybe some of you out there believe it too, a lot of people just think there's one bumblebee. They just think all bumblebees that's the one species. So it's definitely not it's not one, but is it 16, 26, or 37 species in Vermont? Normally I'd hear your answers, but I'm going to skip that part tonight. It turns out there's 16 species historically known in Vermont, plus one that we consider to be a vagrant from further south that isn't established here yet. And I say historically because we're going to get into it. There's not 16 species anymore, but recently we have lost a bunch of species. In the entire northeastern North America, there's about 33 species, and there's about 250 species worldwide. And you can see that bumblebees are sort of, they're a temperate species. So most of the world's diversity of bumblebees is in the temperate zone or in the mountains. Even in South America, there's not that many bumblebee species down in some of the tropical zones. Most of the bumblebee species are along the spine of the Andes. They're a species that likes things cool. They're not necessarily a species that likes to be in very warm environments like the Amazon, for example. You can see that would be the opposite for something like butterflies, where butterflies diversity is just absolutely exploded in the Amazon versus in the temperate zone. So I feel like bumblebees are more like my kind of species. They don't like that 95-degree days that we've been having lately. They like the temperate zone for a reason. You know, you'd think since we only have 16 species or so, maybe 20 if you stretch it to the surrounding states here, that they'd be easy to learn how to identify. It turns out it takes a little work to learn how to identify bumblebees. This image here shows just the queens of about 20 species that exist in the Northeast. And you can see for any species, most of them have many different color morphs. So there's not just one look to them. They might have black in a different spot for a different color morph, and then one might look like the other. They might mimic each other. So it's actually a little bit tricky to identify bumblebees to species. It takes a little practice. Fortunately, with good photographs, and a lot of us have digital cameras right in our pockets all the time now with smartphones, but with decent photographs of the top and the side and the front, about 70% of the images we're able to identify the species. So that opens it up to folks like you helping us find bumblebee species and report them. And I'll talk about that later. And there's also a great book that came out a few years ago that Leif Richardson's name appears on here with a couple other world experts, Bumblebees of North America. And it is an amazing field guide and identification guide. Highly recommend that if you're going to get into bumblebee identification and learning about some of their natural history. That's a great book to have. So it's not for the faint of heart necessarily. It's not easy, but it's not super hard either because, you know, there's only 16 species. You can handle it. But they have their tricks by having these different color morphs. And there are a lot of beautiful, beautiful, beautiful bumblebees. I feel like who doesn't love a bumblebee with their fuzzy, furry look, and some of them with their orange and their yellows and blacks. They're just a beautiful, beautiful bee. So let's get into a little bit about some of their natural history and look at their annual life cycle. It's pretty complex. not all bees are social. In fact, most bees are not social. Out of those 305 species we have in Vermont, most of them are not social bees. But bumblebees, like honeybees, are social bees. And they actually rely on each year, unlike honeybees, they have to rebuild a hive. Honeybees are perennial, and if they make it through the winter, they can take off where they left off and grow their hive bigger. The queen survives, and a lot of the workers survive. But with bumblebees, the only survivor from the previous season is a queen. That's it. So if we start off looking at overwintering, look at the bottom of that image right there, and you'll see the queen is underground. So in the fall, these queens that are alive will come out in the fall. They'll mate with a male, and then they will find a place to dig underground or go underground in a small mammal tunnel, one of the two. And they'll try to get pretty deep, sometimes below the frost line. And they'll sit there in the darkness, kind of in a estivated state for the entire winter, just waiting for spring to come. And when spring finally comes, they're the only ones left. All the males are gone, they're dead. All the workers are dead. The entire genetic stock and population is stored only in these underground queens. That's all that's left. So come springtime, they hop up out of these holes, they dig themselves out, and the first thing they need is energy. They have to build up their energy reserves. So they're going after things like you see this Bombus ternarius nectaring on a willow plant there, because that's willow flowers really early, so they're a popular flower for them to jump on. Many of our woodland ephemeral wildflowers, the bumblebees will be attacking those and getting as much nutrients as they can out of them, sucking up nectar, and then starting to carry pollen around and looking for a place to build a hive. And so in the springtime, you can see all these queens, not only are they foraging, but you can see them searching around on the forest floor or in some open areas, flying really low over the ground, and suddenly they'll dive into the leaf litter and disappear. They're searching usually for small mammal tunnels that are going to be appropriate for them to build a nest in. And once they find that place, they're going to start going back and forth between the early spring flowers and their new nest site, trying to build up these little honey pots you see, and starting to lay the very first eggs, like you see here, these cells of this Bombus griseicolis, because they have to build up as fast as they can workers that will then do the work for them so they can stay in the hive and just lay eggs and never leave again. So for the first part of spring, they're going out and foraging, coming back, going out and foraging, coming back, trying to build up a new colony. Now that image of that griseicolis up in the corner there, we actually Leif Richardson and I were doing some field work in the Champlain Valley, and he saw a clump of thatch from the previous year in a field, and he saw this bumblebee shoot into it, and he gently lifted it up, and this nest was underneath it, and she was sitting on the brood, her first 6 brood on there. And she literally would sit in the middle of those and keep them warm and brood them, because the warmer they are, the faster they'll develop. So early in the spring, it's important for her to keep her energy up and keep heat, just like a bird would keep heat on an egg, to try to have these workers hatch out as fast as they can. And if it's bad weather, she has these little tiny honey pots that she can dip her tongue into and get some nutrients out of if she can't go out and forage. So early spring foraging is really, really important to start the whole new process over again of having hives going. Now, by the time we get to where we are right now, the hives are really well established. The queen now she's never going to leave underground again. She stays in that hive underground, just laying eggs and being fed. And the workers are going out and foraging and taking care of the hive and feeding the young and doing all the work, while she is basically an egg-laying machine. And that's when you have a healthy hive. And a healthy hive could have maybe 50, 100, if they're lucky, and depending on the species, maybe 400 would be a huge hive for a bumblebee. So we're not talking about thousands of bees here. They're relatively small hives. Now, we're getting into, if you look over here at the time periods, so we have these early Queens come out early in May, April, May. And then she builds up the amount of workers. But you'll see here that males start to come out right about now. So July, we have the most workers we're going to have because the hives are big, but we also have males starting to happen. So what happens is the queen had mated in the fall previously, and she had stored the sperm from the male. And when she fertilizes those eggs, those become workers. But when the hive gets big enough and has enough energy, she starts to lay eggs that are unfertilized. And those unfertilized eggs will be males, and they carry all of her genes. They're completely unfertilized and have nothing from the male. Those are all going to be males, drones that come out, and they're starting to come out right now. We're seeing drones now on the flowers right now. They get kicked out of the hive when they become adults, and they go and find a territory on a flower somewhere, and they hunt queens and drink nectar. That's basically what they do for a month or so before they die. That's their life. And she also produces queens, and queens are just female eggs and larvae that are fed a whole lot more and develop into queens. And so what happens then is you'll see this bump coming up right now. It's starting to happen where these new queens are coming out of the hives too. She'll never leave her hive again. She's going to die there at the end of the season, but she's pumping out all these males and all these queens to carry on into the fall, and then those new queens will overwinter underground again, completing the life cycle. So to me, it blows my mind that there's a period in the wintertime where everything is locked up only in the queens that survived. The fresh queens that came out from the summer, everything is locked up in them. There's no workers. There are no males at all. So overwintering and having enough energy over winter, and then coming out of that overwintering period and having enough energy from spring flowers is extremely important for these bees. So it's a pretty complex system, and it's really interesting. The other thing is that there's some tricks that happen too. And one of the tricks is there's actually a group of bumblebees called cuckoo bumblebees, and they're actually social parasites. So the queens of these social parasites, like this one here, which is state endangered, Bombus ashtoni, it is actually a parasite of other bumblebees. So this queen comes out later in the spring or early summer when the regular bumblebees have formed nests, and they will actually find a nest, sneak into the nest, and they'll either kill or subjugate the host queen. Usually they kill it, and then they take over the workers of that host queen through being just kind of mean and spreading pheromones around the nest. And then she'll just start laying her own eggs, and the workers will be duped into taking care of her eggs. So they've come up with a whole system where they kind of cheat the system and come into these hives and take it over. Sort of, you think about like how, in a way, how cowbirds leave their eggs behind in some songbird nests. But these are a little more brutal, and they're actually built for battle. They have a thicker sort of skin or shell, so when they try to get stung, it's hard to sting through it. They're built to fight. They're actually a little bit more U-shaped, so they can turn and fight faster. So they have some morphological adaptations that allow them to take over these nests. Now, this species right here, Bombus ashtoni, the Ashton's cuckoo bumblebee, this one has not been seen in Vermont since 1999. It's been missing. And the reason is because some of these have very specific hosts as their host bees. And this particular species, its host, is a species that's also been missing from Vermont since 1999, the rusty patch bumblebee, which is federally endangered and state endangered. And as both these species go hand in hand, and both of them have been missing for a long time from Vermont, and both of them were formerly pretty common in Vermont, but we'll get into that in a little bit. So there's some crazy stuff going on in the bumblebee wars that happen around us too. Now, the big thing about bumblebees is they're generalist pollinators. There's bumblebees that have short tongues and bumblebees that have long tongues, but in general, they will go to many, many different kinds of flowers, And so they're really the workhorses of pollinators. They're really amazing pollinators. The other thing is that because they only feed on nectar and pollen, they're herbivores. They don't eat anything except plants. And so nectar is kind of their reward for coming to the plant. And the plant uses them, of course, to spread its pollen around. But there's also bees, like this one at the bottom here on the right-hand side, which is on Monarda that you'd find in your garden. There's also thieves. So some of them don't have long enough tongues to get to the nectar. And they will actually go down on to the base of the flower, and they can chew a hole through the base of the flower and then cheat and lick the nectar out of the flower and then never touch the pollen, and so are not really serving as pollinators. So some bees are cheaters and robbers and thieves, and it's just part of the game, I think, of life out there within the bee world. But they're really herbivores, and that makes them such the keystone species that they are in our environment because of passing around all this pollen. One of the things that makes them even more important is they do this thing called buzz pollination. And bumblebees are one of the few bees and insects that can do this. So you can actually witness this in your own garden. If you're growing tomatoes, you want bumblebees, because bumblebees are the pollinators, the best pollinators for tomatoes. Tomatoes and a bunch of other plants actually need buzz pollination for good fruit set. So what the bee does, and like I said, you can go out and watch this in your garden, they will come up to a flower of a tomato, for example. They will latch on to that little tube with their jaws, and they'll start to hum their wings and vibrate them hundreds of times a second, like so fast you can't see their wings moving. And it causes it's amazing sort of like tuning fork like vibration of the flower, and it causes the flower to then release the pollen in copious amounts all over the bee, and enables the bee to also collect it too. And you can see this bee has a big loaf of pollen on its side, like I said earlier. So this is really important for agriculture, because if you want to grow tomatoes in a hothouse, for example, and you want to get really good fruit set, you need bumblebees. And so we're going to get into this problem in a second, but a lot of hothouses that grow tomatoes actually will buy bumblebee hives to put in their hothouses temporarily to actually super increase fruit set on their tomato plants, because the bees are going to go around and do this buzz pollination. So it's absolutely key for some plants. They just don't get pollinated without this special kind of pollination. The other crazy thing is that flowering plants have an electric charge, and the bees do too. So it makes it even better. So the bees flying through the air, it causes friction, and so they build up a slightly positive charge as they're buzzing through the air. And when the plants, the flowers, actually have a slightly negative charge. And so here's a picture of a bumblebee going into a flower in my garden, and coming out absolutely covered in pollen on its hairs. And yeah, it may have rubbed up against the anthers to get that pollen on it, but the pollen grains can actually literally jump off from static electricity from the flower to the bee, from a negative charge to a positive charge. And it turns out that the flower then, for about 2 to 3, up to 5 minutes, won't have that charge. And it's thought that the bees can actually sense that, and they preferentially will skip flowers that have no charge, because they know a bee has just been there, so it probably doesn't have as much nectar to suck up. And so they can actually sense this charge somehow. So there's this crazy thing going on with static electricity and pollen too, that helps the plants get the pollen onto the bee hairs too. It's just amazing to me. The other thing, and this is something that Leif Richardson, my guru, studied for his PhD at Dartmouth, is that the bees actually are little ethnobotanists. They actually use plants as medicine. Leif did a ton of works, both in the laboratory and out in the wild, studying this. bees have a lot of parasites, and we're going to talk about that in a second. And one of the parasites is this gut parasite that you see at the top. It's this weird looking thing with a tail. It's a tiny microscopic gut parasite that lives inside of bumblebees, and if they have a lot of them, it can make them really sick and kill them, actually, if they have too many. Well, when they're sick, it turns out that they will seek out plants that have chemicals that can knock back parasites. So, for example, this is turtlehead, which you've probably seen in wetlands near you. And here's a picture I took of a bee crawling into the turtlehead. Turtlehead is actually poisonous to a certain extent. It's got a poison in it that is in its nectar, it's in its pollen, and it's in its leaves. And bees will preferentially go to that plant when they're sick and drink more nectar from that plant. And it makes them a little bit ill too, but it actually wipes out some of the parasite load. So they're actually medicating themselves by going to these plants. And Leaf has shown this really interesting work. He's shown this in the lab, like I said, and in the wild, where bees that are more infected will spend a lot more time going to plants like turtlehead. So they're self-medicating themselves. So it's a wild world out there for bumblebees. And the more you start studying them and looking at them, the more you realize what there is out there. The other thing is they're super. It turns out they're super intelligent, and recent work shows that you can actually teach them to play games. So there's been some research recently where they will, if they take a ball and push it around into a goal, that they'll be rewarded a sugary treat. And once they learn that, they'll start to push the ball in the goal more and more just to get at the sugary sweet. So they can actually be taught to play games to get after what is in effect food. So they have a thought process. They somehow to be able to put this ball in a goal. So it's just endless when it comes to looking at some of these things, the crazy natural history you find and learn about some of these wild bees. So with that in mind, back in 2012, as I mentioned earlier, I got together with Leif Richardson, and we really decided that, and Mark Ferguson with the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department and others, we really decided we had to do some surveys. There was just a lot of worldwide angst over bumblebees and other bees populations crashing, especially in Europe and in some places where they've been studied in the United States and Canada. And we realized there really wasn't much known for Vermont. There's just really little known. So we decided we needed to go into all the historic collections and look at all the bumblebees that were collected in the past if we could, but also see if we could go out and atlas and survey all the bumblebees across Vermont for a couple of years while the funding lasted, really. So Leif and Sarah Zandra and Brendan Collins and Spencer Hardy, Larry Clarefeld, Shannon Mice, and some others joined forces with us for a couple of years. And then we recruited folks like you. There's probably some of you out there that helped. Community scientists that just got interested in bumblebees, or a lot of them were interested in butterflies. And I said, hey, let's start looking at bumblebees. So they started looking at bumblebees with us. So just, about 50 or 60 people decided that they could help us to survey, which is really key. You just can't, it would be impossible to do these kind of surveys without folks like you just getting super interested in looking at things like bumblebees around your neck of the woods. It'd be economically and prohibitively difficult for just a few biologists to do this on such a large scale. So what did we do? We actually went across the state, and took us about 2.5 years, but we surveyed all across the state, definitely in every county, almost every town, and we got about 10,000 bumblebee records. But the key thing is that we had a reasonably sized historic data set that we put together too. And we couldn't have done that without something like the University of Vermont insect collections. So these insect collections have turned out over and over to be really important to jumping in a time machine and being able to see, at least from a 10,000 foot level, about what happened 25, 50, even 100 years ago, based on what was collected by students and professors and others during those times and put into the museum collection. So I can't stress enough how important it is for institutions like UVM, Middlebury, and others to that have these collections and keep these collections safe and sound, and continue to have them available to research. So we went in the collections at UVM and a bunch of other institutes and actually made sure everything was identified properly. And luckily at UVM, since maybe as early as the mid-1950s, students were required to do an insect collection there to pass Entomology 101. And so we had a lot of collections from students who knew nothing about bumblebees, but knew they had to collect a bunch of bumblebees in order to pass their class, which was great for us because they would just see a bumblebee, not care what species it was, net it, and put it in their collection. And so we feel like we got a really good sample of what was actually flying around the UVM region and for even further out in certain periods of time going back in the historic record. So long story short, we were able to compare what we did in modern times to what has been collected in the past in Vermont and sort of get an eye on what may have changed over, say, the last 100 years of bumblebee data in the state. And this is what happened. So we have all the species lined up by their species name over here. Sorry, it's in Latin. There are common names for all these, but many of us forget what the common names are because we just start calling them in Latin, and it's awful. I apologize for that. But what we found is when we compared present time relative abundance to past is that over half of the bumblebees declined. So all these are species that declined. And a good portion of them, though, actually had more bumblebees. So it's not like you can just say all bumblebees have declined over the last 100 years in Vermont. It's really species by species of what has happened. And, you kind of expect that. Some are more sensitive to some things than others. But what was really shocking to us is that all these species that are bold, these are species that actually are now gone from Vermont. They're extirpated. We haven't found a single one since they disappeared. So Bombus affinis, this is the species I mentioned earlier, the rusty-patched bumblebee. It's now only found regularly in the upper Midwest in Minnesota and Wisconsin. It hasn't been seen in Vermont since 1999. And it was actually really common in student collections in the 1960s, in the 70s, even into the 80s. It was pretty common in their collections. So they weren't actually hunting for it because they didn't know to hunt for it. So it must have been relatively abundant. Same thing with Terricola, a species that is now still present, but we'll talk about in a second. Excuse me, it's still present, but it is actually a threatened species in Vermont, and it's in trouble in many places in eastern North America. And then Pennsylvanicus, which is a species that likes to be in large meadows and hayfields, has also disappeared from Vermont. We haven't found one since the year 2000 at all in Vermont. We've looked hard in very large hayfields across the Champlain Valley for this species, so it's gone. These two species were Fernaldi and Solaris were really rare in the first place. So it was, not finding them is not a surprise. They've always been kind of rare. And Ashtoni, which I mentioned, one of the cuckoos, it actually inhabits Aphanis and Terricola nests. So it disappearing when these disappeared or almost disappeared is not surprising at all. The cool thing is that in the last 2 years, they've been starting to find Ashtoni in Quebec and in Maine. So now we have high hopes that we might accidentally have someone find a small population here in Vermont too soon. And the other neat thing is Fernaldi, which was only known from 2 specimens in the UVM collection, one in 1938 and one I think in 1969. All of a sudden, starting in 2018, Leif Richardson found a few, Spencer Hardy found a few. Last year, we had folks taking photographs, accidentally finding them scattered across Vermont. And this year already, I think we have 4 or 5 records scattered across Vermont again. So it looks like this bee somehow has come back and is actually maybe on the trail of being more abundant than it was in the past. So each one of these species has a story to tell, I think, and we're in the infancy of uncovering the story of each one of these. So the bottom line is there's, it's not every single bumblebee crashing over the last, say, 50 years, but there's been a considerable number of species that have been either lost or has really declined in abundance. And that's concerning. So let's dig in a little bit with Rusty Patch. Yeah, you got something?
Yeah, really quick question. What is the criteria for when a bumblebee is declared lost? How many years does it have to be not present in the state?
It's a really good question. There's no criteria, and biologists fight all the time when they can declare something extirpated or extinct. And sometimes we even declare something like that and then come to find somebody will find a population somewhere or it pops up. It's there's only so many of us looking for these species. So having not seen Rusty Patch Bumblebee in Vermont or New Hampshire or Maine or New York or any of the eastern states except for Virginia, and since 2000 or so, it's pretty safe that if they're here, they're really, really rare. I mean, so we call it, we say it's extirpated, but there's no hard fast rule for that. Really. It's just been 20 years since we've seen it. I every year hope that right about now somebody sends a picture in of one of these and we're like, great, there's a population that was hidden or they came back. And it's possible. I keep looking all the time, and I keep hoping that people keep looking, because honestly, I fully suspect one day to find Rusty Patch Bumblebee. It just wouldn't shock me. And I'll explain why in a second. So yeah, there's no hard fast rule really, and some of these species could just turn up again. But here's Bombus affinis records. So you can see in the 60s, 70s, it just sort of started to peter out, and then all of a sudden in the 90s, it really got low in the collections. And then, like I said, we've looked. Many of us have looked hard, and we haven't seen it anywhere. And here's a quick map of where they are from the collections. And the map it's biased because it's concentrated around UVM or around down here Middlebury College, or where a professor used to live or something. So that I'm sure that there are plenty of them in the Connecticut River Valley too. They were in New Hampshire, they were in Maine, they were in Massachusetts. So it wasn't an uncommon bee. So everybody on the lookout for this one. It's federally endangered now. And there's a lot of work going on in the upper Midwest to try to figure out why it's endangered, and also to figure out what we can do about it. The great thing is we know how to raise bumblebees. So I also have hope one day that perhaps we can figure out what really happened or is happening to these bees, and we could even bring this back to Vermont from other populations, sort of like we did with peregrine falcons. Why couldn't we do that with bumblebees? So it's one of my long-term hopes that we can solve this and actually bring this species back here. So the other one was Tricola, the yellow-banded bumblebee, and just like its cohort there, it disappeared in 1999 too. In fact, from 1999 until 2004, a bunch of people were looking for it and couldn't find it anywhere in Vermont at all. It seemed to have just totally disappeared. And suddenly in 2004, I think Leaf found one, and then someone else found one in 2005. It just was like someone was finding one accidentally. And then suddenly in 2008, there was a bunch of them around reported, 2009 even more. And then when we started the atlas, you can see on this map, we found a whole bunch of them around starting in 2012. And now this sort of recovery seems to be continuing. We're finding, I just was at a person's garden, and they were all over their sunflowers in their garden. The interesting thing is that it seems to be only happening with this species in cooler climates. So it's happening in northern New England, Vermont, New Hampshire, especially in Maine and Quebec. But if you move down to Massachusetts and further south where Tricola used to be, where the yellow-banded bumblebee used to be, it's not recovering at all. And in fact, doesn't even exist in some places. So there's some thoughts right now, and there's some work going on that this bee, in its cooler climates where it can exist, has done better and may be able to fight off a disease that I'll talk about in a second much better in these cool climates. So there could be an interaction between cooler climates and this disease that allows this bee to actually survive and come back from it. So it's actually a little bit of a success story. It seems to be on its own coming back into Vermont better more and more each year. And so we might be able to remove that one day from the threatened list, the state threatened list, just because we've done, we haven't done anything, but it somehow has come back on its own. And if we can figure out what that is, maybe we can figure it out for other bees like rusty patch bumblebee. So why are all these things declining? It's pretty complex, as you'd imagine, but there's 4 basic things. One is transmitted diseases into the wild populations from commercially reared bumblebees and also honeybee hives, and we're going to talk about that in a second. Fragmentation and loss of habitat is really huge. It's maybe not as big in parts of Vermont or most of Vermont, but in the entire eastern seaboard, it's a big deal in places outside of Vermont. So that sort of makes us want to double down a little bit more in Vermont, because we've got habitats that are really great for bees. We don't want to lose that like we've lost in other places. The third thing is pesticide use. We're going to talk about that in a second. There's been some relatively new class of pesticides that are really horrible for bees. And we're starting to learn more and more about interactions between different pesticides that are sublethal to bees, but turns out it's reducing their productivity in their hives. So I'll talk about that in a second. And then finally, kind of the thing that's an umbrella over everything these days is climate change. And you might get sick of hearing it, but it's true, and it's a big deal. And we're seeing it happen. There's study after study already showing climate change is hitting bumblebees already in North America and Europe. It's happening already to many bumblebees. And we'll talk about that real quick. So the first one, let's talk about disease spillover. And I think we're all familiar with the disease spillover right now, because if we didn't have disease spillover, I'd be talking to you in person instead of online. So we know what disease spillover is like, and guess what? The bumblebees do too. So here's a tomato greenhouse at an undisclosed location in Vermont, and in these greenhouses, they often will buy bumblebee hives from bumblebee farms, and it's perfectly legal. It was started in Europe back in the 80s. The Europeans discovered how to raise bumblebees in captivity. It's actually not easy, and it was a trade secret that they held on to for quite a while, apparently. And it enabled them to grow a lot of tomatoes in hothouses in Europe. And they decided at one point that they had a big market in the United States. So they came to the United States and got one of our native bumblebees, took it back to Europe, raised it in Europe, and then sold it back to Canada and the United States as a native bee. But it was already in Europe. And that sort of started the whole bumblebee farming trend. And now the bumblebees are raised in the United States and Canada, not in Europe like that, but for a while they were shipped from Europe. But they were a native species to the North America, so they were allowed to ship them right back. There were no rules. You can buy right now. You can go online, type into Google, and you'll find you can order yourself a bumblebee hive tomorrow, and it'll be shipped to you. They cost about $200 a piece, and they come in a box like you see at the bottom here. And they'll put them in the greenhouse, and that hive will just immediately go to work as soon as they open it, and they'll go out and buzz pollinate the heck out of these things, and they'll get a great fruit set. So it's win-win for the farmers. The problem is the bumblebees travel. And so if you looked at the bottom here, you'll see that's a bumblebee coming out of the box and it's starting to fly away. And if you look at the next one, it flew away outside the greenhouse to some flowers that were outside the greenhouse. And it's collecting stuff from these flowers. You can see its corbicula is filled with a loaf of pollen there. So these bumblebees, they wander outside the greenhouse. They just don't stay inside. The greenhouses have to have openings to exchange air and everything. So the bumblebees, although they're hitting those tomato plants hard, they're also leaving and going outside too. The problem is that a lot of these bumblebees, at least back in the day, now they're supposedly disease-free, supposedly. They carried this gut parasite, Crithidia bombi, which I mentioned earlier, this tiny little protozoan parasite. And we think that they also carried it over from Europe, and it might have been a strain from Europe that some of these bumblebees really were not resistant to. So it was sort of like when Europeans came to North America and brought smallpox to the Native American population. It was a brand new disease, and it's just like that with bumblebees too. It's just a brand new disease that some of these just couldn't handle. And some of those were rusty patch bumblebee and the Terricola. Both of them very closely related to bumblebees, very sensitive to Crithidia bombi. And you'll find that the way that this parasite is passed is probably on flowers. So bumblebees have to go to the bathroom too, and they have to spit too, and they spit it all out on flowers. And so they spit some of this Crithidia out too, and the next bumblebee that comes licks up and laps up this Crithidia. So here you have, in this example on globe thistle, you have Terricola, Ternarius, and Bimaculatus, 3 species at one time on this flower. Excuse me. So if one of them has this disease, it's going to pass it on to everybody else that's coming onto that flower. So when you have these bumblebees that come out of these hothouses, if they have Crithidia, they're probably going to pass it on to the wild populations that are also foraging near the greenhouses. So in fact, a bunch of years ago, there was a study done in Ontario, and it's since been studied all over the place, looking at the incidence of Crithidia bombi spillover from greenhouses to wild populations of bumblebees. And so the closer they sampled to the greenhouse, the more likely they were to find that the wild bumblebees were infected. And the infection could move a couple kilometers away from the greenhouse a month, so it spread pretty fast. So the thought is that a lot of these species really got hammered by some of these spillover diseases from raised bumblebees in captivity. And then once it's in the wild population, it just keeps spreading, and it got worse and worse and really did some damage to the population. So disease spillover is a huge concern. Now, what about honeybees? Well, first a little bit word about honeybees, because I'm not talking about honeybees at all tonight, except for right now, because honeybees they're a domesticated non-native animal that was brought to the Western Hemisphere. And there's a whole group of people that study honeybees for agricultural purposes, and they're really important for agricultural purposes. But when you study wild bees, it's sort of like, well, it's a little bit like an ornithologist that studies warblers studying chickens. They just don't study chickens. Bumblebees are wild bees, and sort of honeybees are kind of like the chickens of the bee world. They're a domesticated non-native animal used in agriculture. But the problem is that they also compete with the native bees for resources, and they also can carry diseases that can affect native species. And so there's long been a thought that just like farming bumblebees, farming honeybees, there could be a spillover from honeybees diseases to bumblebees and other native bees. And in fact, recently, Samantha Alger, she was a PhD student, now a professor at UVM, did some work recently in the Champlain Valley and elsewhere, looking at this very question: is there spillover of RNA diseases from honeybees to bumblebees? And so she did laboratory and experiments out in the field, and found out that indeed it looks like that there's several RNA diseases that Apis mellifera, that honeybees carry, that they can pass on to bumblebees because they're foraging on the same kind of flowers. And so you can see where there's high levels of deformed wing virus, which is an RNA disease. Where there's high levels in Apis and honeybees, there's also a stronger prevalence of it found in the wild bumblebees nearby. And where there isn't any of Apis caught, there actually is none. So it's clear that it's clear that honeybees can pass disease onto these wild bumblebees. And We all know RNA diseases too, because RNA diseases is why, once again, I'm sitting here and you're sitting at home. Our COVID-19 disease is an RNA disease too. So we're quite familiar with these kind of things ourselves too. So disease is a big thing. The next big thing really is climate change. And a study that came out very recently, earlier this year, looked at Europe and a huge data set of bumblebee data from Europe and the United States that goes back decades, if not more than decades. They went back 100 years, and includes a bunch of data that we collected, and some of you might have helped collect too. It was all in there too. So there's thousands and thousands and thousands of data points here from Europe and the United States for bumblebee records, from museums, from surveys, and everywhere. And Peter Surier at University of Ottawa put it all together, working with Jeremy Kerr up there, and started to think about, okay, what can we look at over this 100 years of data in relation to climate change? Is it having an effect? And what would that effect really look like? And it turned out, in a nutshell, that it isn't just slowly about climate change happening. It's not about, oh, it's a little bit warmer or it's a little bit wetter. It's actually about how hot and how wet it gets in events. So it's big events, like when it's 95 degrees for 3 straight days in northern Vermont, for example. Those events are really hard on bumblebees. And so they came up with a measurement that was sort of a thermal position index for bees. So it's the preferred thermal and wet and precipitation index for each species of bumblebees. And then they could average this over the community and create this map of what has happened compared 1900 to 1974 compared to in the 2000s. And so areas that the thermal average position is really skyrocketed are obviously bright red, and those that are blue, it's actually gone the opposite, and 0 is white. And you can see Europe is a hot mess, and the bumblebee populations have really fallen away there. And you can even see actually in the Northeast here that, especially around Vermont, we're actually in the orange area. So we've had a hot mess happen here with bumblebees too. So the thermal position on average has changed too much for many bumblebee species in these regions. And if you take that model and then map it across and look at the change in species richness across both continents, you get a map like this. So big changes are red and no changes are white or blue. And you can see that there's changes almost everywhere. And particularly if you look closely at the Northeast, we've had about a 15% decline on average of species richness in the Northeast. And that jives with what we've been seeing physically out there too. So, and then this was a really complex study, but in a nutshell, it's already happened. And it's already happening with bumblebees. We're already passing out of a lot of species preferred thermal and precipitation range across some of the species ranges, especially in Vermont here too. So it's already happening, and it's going to get worse. And then finally, pesticides, which is a huge bucket of problems, and there's been a lot of work done very recently. And when we think about pesticides, we often think just about the lethality of pesticides, and there's a lot of pesticides that will outright just kill bumblebees at certain levels, and we've seen events like that happen. A few years ago there was an event in Oregon, for example, where pesticides were applied to an ornamental tree that was flowering illegally, and there were thousands of dead bumblebees in a parking lot of a supermarket, to the point where the supermarket parking lot was slippery with dead bees. That doesn't happen as much. It's usually, it turns out, sublethal, or even we're finding out more and more synergistic effects between pesticides affecting bumblebees and other wild bees. And we're now starting to be able to link some of these to actual declines in their abundance and diversity. And it's all pretty recent work that's been going on, but not recent. It's recent enough that just we know what we need to do, but we haven't been doing it. And one of them is neonicotinoid insecticides. This insecticide was came about in the market in the late 80s, or designed in the late 80s, and really came on the market, I think, in like 1994 or so, and has exploded in use since then. But it turns out that this class of insecticide is really, really harsh on bees, even at minute amounts, to the point, and there's been enough work to the point that the EU completely banned them. You're not allowed to use them at all in the EU, and that was in 2018. We have not done that in the United States, but we have done a little bit in Vermont with this pesticide. Just last year, it was changed to a Class A pesticide. So at least now you have to be an approved licensed applicator to use this pesticide, and it can only be used for certain things. It's a start, but it left a huge gap. Most of the things that are used are for coating seeds. A lot of our corn, soybeans, things like that, all the seeds are coated with neonics. So when the plant grows, this is a systemic insecticide. When the plant grows, it actually grows with the neonics in it, built automatically in it from the seed, and so has this pesticide effect right built into it. And it happens when it flowers, it'll be in its pollen, it'll be in its nectar, it's in its leaves, it's in its roots, it's in everything. This law in 2019 doesn't affect any of that. It doesn't affect pet care products. So things that are given to dogs and cats for flea and tick control, they usually have neonicotinoids in them. And there's been, as far as I know, there's been no work on what happens when cats and dogs leave their excrement in the environment. What has happened to those neonics? Are they coming out in that, and are they being taken up in the environment? So the things don't stay in one spot; they move around like that, and they're systemic. And so, hence, they were banned in the EU. And hopefully, we'll do better soon in the United States. But at least we took a first step in Vermont with a bill became law in 2019. And I'll talk a little bit more about neonics in a second. One thing I will point out over here, there's this great, if you go to the Xerces Society webpage, you can download, or if someone wants a link, I can post it. You can download this little guide to household and garden sprays, and it indicates to you what to look for in the label to know that it's a neonic in it. You're not supposed to be able to buy this in Vermont anymore because of the law in 2019, but I'm not sure how enforced it is. Also, you can go across into New Hampshire and buy it too, and you could use it and not even know you're using it on some of your plants. So it's a great little guide to help you understand what household sprays and stuff you might have for your garden would contain some of these neonics in it accidentally. The other big thing that's just really coming about now is the link of fungicides to declines in bumblebees. It's sort of in the early days of this research, but people didn't think fungicides had anything to do with insects or bees, and it turns out that for bumblebees, they can be horrible to them, especially they have synergistic effects with other pesticides and can wreak havoc on bumblebee populations. So was a study across the United States looking at predictors of fungicide application and what has happened to the 4 declining bumblebee species, and there was a really strong correlations to how much fungicide was used on these plots and how the contraction of some of these declining bumblebee ranges have been. They really correlated quite nicely with the fungicides. So there was a smoking gun there. And then there's been some work done over at Cornell looking, they often use fungicides in apple orchards when things are just about to bloom. And it turns out that they found pre-bloom fungicide sprays really had a negative relationship with bee abundance in those orchards. So fungicides are turning out to be looking like to be a very important problem for bumblebees and other wild bees. So, but neonicotinoids are really well known to be a problem. And the more we look at some of these synergistic effects, the more we start to find problems with these bees. Here's one of the neonics is imidacloprid, and it's, talking about, it doesn't necessarily outright kill them, but it can actually change their behavior. This was an amazing study recently done, where they actually took bees in the lab, and they also did it out in the wild, and they put little tiny pieces of paper on their backs that had a little code on it, and a camera could read the code and map out where the bee was moving in the hive constantly. So you see it's mapping out each one of these bees' movements when it can read the codes. And so they would know which bee is which. It was like the bee had a social security number and what it was doing in the hive. And long story short, those bumblebees that were exposed to imidacloprid, they tended to contribute far less work to the welfare of the hive than bees that did not have, were not infected by the pesticide. And so it didn't outright kill them in these very small doses. What it did was it made them kind of stupid. It made them not do their work. And so what happens in these hives that pick up small amounts of this out in the wild is that the productivity of the hive can be really low, and maybe the hive could even die off. And it also increases the amount of disease they can have too. So it's these insidious little effects with not outright killing are a really important aspect of some of these insecticides. And how much are we using in the United States? Well, this is from USGS looking at the amount of imidacloprid, which is a kind of neonicotinoid used on crops in the United States. And you can see starting in 1994 when it came on the market, it was quickly adopted. And now we're up to pretty high levels, used, like I said, on all kinds of things, including put on seeds of all these things before they're planted. So if we look at it spatially, not much in 1994, but you can see how fast in the 90s that this pesticide was adopted and continues to be used very regularly across much of the United States in agricultural settings. In Vermont, too, all over the place. So it's in our environment, it's all around us, and we know it has a huge effect on bumblebees and other native bees. So the big story really with all these, everything from disease spillover to habitat loss to insecticide exposure, is that there's all these synergistic effects that we're starting to piece together. So it's not just one thing. We can't just point to one thing and say, you know what, it's actually neonicotinoids. Nope, guess what? It's fungicide. No, it's disease. It turns out they're all working together probably in different levels and different areas to knock back and lower bee populations. So it's looking more and more like it's not one thing we can do. It's everything we need to do. We need to clean up our act on a lot of things to make bees have a much more habitable landscape. And that's a daunting task, to say the least. Some of the strategies, there's a lot of strategies going on, and there's more and more work, especially in Canada, about trying to figure out nationwide strategies. But there's things we can jump on, I think, that we're not. We should be leveraging farm bill programs to help with this. We need increased oversight of the commercial bumblebee and industry. Pesticide research is pretty strong right now. We need to have the stomach to have stronger regulation for it, or come up with alternatives and put those alternatives into action. And then we don't have any way to track bumblebee populations. So our short-term studies that we did are great, but there's no standardized bumblebee monitoring program like we have for birds and other things. There's barely any tracking of declining species by federal and state agencies because they just don't have the funding. So even if we do things, we need to have monitoring of some sort to know that what we're doing is helping or we're not doing enough. And right now, we just don't have that. We don't have that test to find out if things are going well or not. We just have anecdotal stuff. And finally, wrapping up here, there's a lot of stuff we can do by providing habitat and floral resources, and we can do that ourselves. There's been this Million Pollinator Garden Challenge that I like to point out. Like, it's amazing what a small pollinator garden in your yard or a meadow you don't mow as much can do for the region's bumblebees. Bumblebees can travel sometimes many kilometers to forage. So when you when you're providing flower resources for bumblebees, you're providing it for a pretty large area sometimes. So, joining in on something like the Million Pollinator Garden Challenge, which here's all the dots up here of everyone that signed up their gardens. Mine's signed up on here. I have a tiny little, 1/4 acre plot of land here on the edge of town, and I have a very small pollinator garden that's maybe 30 feet long and 10 feet wide, but it's filled with milkweed and other pollinators, plants, and there's just so many bees in there. It's a joy to go out in the morning in the summer with a cup of coffee and just check out the bees in there and know that you're providing for them for a pretty far region around. So doing something in our yards can be a big deal. The other thing I said is crowdsourced biodiversity data. So if you're not familiar with it, iNaturalist is a free program that we use a lot, and we get people to collect bumblebee data and other wild bee data for us on it. It's a free app, or you can just use any camera and upload it on using the internet off of your computer. And you don't even have to know what kind of bumblebee you're taking a picture of. You can just say, you know what, I took these 3 pictures of this bumblebee. You post it up there, and people like Spencer Hardy or Nathaniel Sharp, who's helping me online right now, and even some worldwide experts, they jump on there and help us ID all these things if you can't ID them. And that helps us build up data sets over time for what's happening in Vermont and beyond right now. So it's really important, even if you're just doing it in your backyard, to survey the bumblebees and other bees around you, even if you don't know what you're looking at, as long as you take half decent pictures so we can ID some of these things. And like I said, one of these days, I'm hoping somebody is going to snap a picture of Rusty Patch Bumblebee accidentally, and it'll be sitting right there on iNaturalist for us to look at, and it can start a whole new journey for us in bringing a species back too. So crowdsourced biodiversity data, hit us up at iNaturalist. We have workshops for this often. It's a great program. You're going to learn a lot using it. It's fun to use. And I'm honestly completely addicted to it. So I'm on it all the time around my area here too. So we'll leave you with one last slide. And that is this picture that came from iNaturalist yesterday, actually. Declan McCabe, a professor up at St. Mike's College, sent me a message on iNaturalist, said, hey, you got to look at this picture I took of a common eastern bumblebee in my yard in his pollinator patch. He's like, it's got a beetle hanging off its antenna. I opened it up and I had no idea that these things existed. But this is a silky fungus beetle. And until yesterday, I had no idea they existed. Declan saw this on the antenna of a bee that he was taking a picture of, got a close-up of it, and said, you got to look at this, Kent. It turns out that these beetles hang out on flowers. They wait for a bumblebee to come, and then they latch onto the bumblebee with their jaws to be carried back to the bumblebee's nest, where they drop off inside the nest, and there they eat waste products of the bumblebees. They apparently don't hurt the nest. They just wander around eating waste products and lay eggs and have larvae and then hatch out and leave. And so, but they hitch rides. They can't find the nest themselves. They hitch rides off the flowers and out of the nest back and forth as adults, riding on bumblebees like this. And so here's one he took a picture of attached to the bumblebee's antenna. And like I said, you start looking in your pollinator garden at things like this, and this is the kind of stuff you discover with a sharp eye. I never even knew these existed, and it was just an amazing new world opened up yesterday when I opened up my iNaturalist account, and Declan had shared this with me. So I encourage you to get out there and watch bumblebees and think about where you're buying your food from and how it's grown and how that affects bees too. And we got a tough road to hoe, I think, for bumblebee conservation and bee conservation in general. But I think it's actually a road that we have to go down, and we have to do it well, because these are keystone species. And with that, I'll open it up for questions or anything else you might want.
All right, awesome. So I've been keeping track of a couple of the questions that have come in. One that was pretty recent in regards to one of your slides a few back. Are there any type of bumblebee houses that someone can buy to create a home for bumblebees?
There aren't, but so I've tried a few. Let's see. I've tried a few plans to build bumblebee nest boxes, and they've failed every time. There's the Europeans have come up with a tube nest that you can bury, that would like mimic a rodent's den or something, and they've had success with it, I guess, in Europe, but bunches of people have tried it in North America and it doesn't really work. Another person who was actually studying chickadees found out that a large number of their chickadee boxes that they had actually ended up having bumblebee nests in them. And so we got the idea to mimic their chickadee boxes, which they're making out of PVC pipe. And so one year, a whole bunch of us all over the place in Eastern North America put out these things to see if they'd work, and we like barely got any nests in them. So the answer is not really, but we keep trying to come up with ways to make artificial nest sites for these things. Just to, it'd be fun to do, and maybe it could help them, but so far it doesn't work.
Gotcha. Another question in regards to that map you shared of bumblebee diversity. Why do you think there aren't any bumblebee species in Africa? Is it no one's looking, or is there something else that fills that niche, or is it just not temperate enough?
I think it's not temperate enough. I think where you see some of them is probably there's some mountains, but it's not temperate enough. It's too hot, too low. Yeah, that's my guess. I've never even been there, so I don't know.
Someone else had a question about bumblebees going into honeybee hives in the fall. Is that something you've noticed or know anything about?
No, but I've actually had a couple of people say that they've noticed that, and I have no idea what they're doing other than maybe they're robbing stuff out of the hive. I mean, maybe they're robbing honey. I don't know what they're doing. No idea, but it's not the first person that's mentioned that to me. I wonder if they're males actually, though, because it's always in the fall. I wonder if they're drones going in and getting a cheap snack. But yeah.
And then one more question about anyone in Vermont working towards legislation for banning neonics and other things like that.
I've heard of rumors that people are trying to do that, trying to come up with working their way towards that, but I have not heard officially that someone's actually doing it. It was happening more strongly in 2017 across North America, and then with the new administration in 2017, I think that kind of fell apart. But yeah, again, it's banned in Europe, so we have to find the willpower to do something here.
And then one more question about bumblebees sort of going home. Is it true that some bumblebees will hole up overnight in flowers instead of going back to the nest?
I think they definitely do. Some workers get caught out, I think, and get cooled off. You'll find them on sunflowers, but often too, if you look, those are often males and they don't have a nest to go back to. But workers, that does happen to workers sometimes, I think, because I find workers that are like kind of slow, it cooled off in the evening and they can't get back. But for the most part, I think if you look carefully and you know what you're looking for, you come to a bumblebee workshop and you know it's a male. It's often males because that's what they do. They bivy. They don't have nests to go back to. They have a territory. And so in the morning, if you go to sunflowers in your garden, especially starting now, it'll be a bunch of male bees sitting on the sunflowers. And they're cooled off. And here's the other thing is males can't sting. So if you get good and you know it's a male, you can actually pick the male up. You can pet it. He'll put his leg up in defense a little bit, but they can't sting. They have no stinger. So it's a great party trick. You can grab a male bumblebee and hold it in your hand and like, look. All right, maybe it's have to be a specific party like with bee people, but still. I will say, full disclosure, that one time I did try that party trick I was with a couple of bee people and I grabbed one and I made a mistake. It was definitely not a male and it stung me right in the palm. So serves me right for irritating it.
All right. Well, that's all of the questions that are in the chat right now. And this has been recorded. So if anyone wants to go back and look over any of the slides that Ken showed, we'll be getting that out to everyone shortly, I think.
Yeah, if you go to the Vermont Atlas of Life, and I'm sure Jim will probably share the link somewhere too, but the link will be up there. If you just Google Vermont Atlas of Life, you'll get to our webpage. It'll be there to watch again or share with people. And honestly, if you have questions or observations, or you want to learn how to use iNaturalist or something and you're stuck, I mean, drop me an email. And Nathaniel, who you've been listening to, is an iNaturalist expert too. Drop him an email more than me, because he's even better at iNaturalist. And he'll get you rolling too. We're always happy to answer questions and get people excited about biodiversity and natural history and bumblebees and butterflies and everything. So please, you're not bugging us. Email us, ask us questions. All right. Well, Jim, does Jim have anything?
I'll unmute him really quick.
Okay. Yeah, just no questions, Kent, but thanks a lot to you and Nathaniel for putting this together. Excellent presentation, and I encourage people to please tell others about this presentation and how they can see it and connect to it, because it has been recorded. There are lots of conservation challenges out there, and the more people who are spreading the word, the more we're going to get done.
Yeah, agreed.
So
thanks a lot. I really appreciate the invite, Jim. It's great, and I love the work you guys are doing over there. I appreciate it.
So on behalf of the Salisbury Conservation Commission, Kent and Nathaniel, thanks a whole heck of a lot.
All right. Take care, everyone. Have a good night.